I thought the rules of life you should read. Okay, and basically, Dr. Jung says there ain't no rules. So the rules of life. In reply to your kind inquiry about rules of life, I would like to remark that I have had so much to do with people that I have always endeavored to live by no rules as far as possible. Non-observance of rules requires, of course, far less effort, for usually one makes a rule in order to repress the tendency in oneself not to follow it. In psychology, above all, rules are valid only when they can be reversed. Also, they are not without their dangers, since they consist of words, and our civilization is largely founded on a superstitious belief in words. One of the supreme religious assumptions is actually the word. Words can take the place of men and things. This has its advantages, but it is also a menace. One can then spare oneself the trouble of thinking for oneself or making any effort to one's own advantage or disadvantage and that of one's fellows. I have, for instance, a tendency to make a principle of doing what I want to do or should do as soon as possible. This can be very unwise and even stupid. The same applies to practically all adages and rules of life. Take, for example, the saying, "Whatever it be, act prudently and consider the end." But in this way, however praiseworthy the principle is, you can let a vitally important decision of the moment slip through your fingers. No rules can cope with the paradoxes of life. Moral law, like natural law, represents only one aspect of reality. It does not prevent one from following certain regular habits unconsciously, habits which one does not notice oneself, but can only discover by making careful inquiries among one's fellows. But people seldom enjoy having what they don't know about themselves pointed out to them by others, and so they prefer to lay down rules which are the exact opposite of what they are doing in reality. So it kind of sums it up. Dr. Jung was about psychic wholeness, about finding yourself and making your own judgments about what is moral and right. And that didn't necessarily always comport with the religion. When he came to the end of his life, he was interviewed by the BBC, and you could actually find this on YouTube. And the interviewer asked him, "And do you now believe in God?" And he said, "Well, very complicated, but I have no need to believe, I know." And that was, for me, that was an epiphany, because I too know, but it doesn't require me to believe anything that is taught in the four corners of a church. And so what Jung did was, between age 11 and age 79 or 80, when that interview was done, he found God. Let's put it that way. He found God. And he found that God as God exists in the psychological sphere. Okay, he never claimed to say anything about the metaphysical God. Okay, is there a God who created the universe? He never said anything about that per se. But in point of fact, everything in the psyche is metaphysical. It's not physical. It's a bunch of chemicals that run around in your head, right? and so there's no physical aspect to anything in your psyche, and yet it's an entire universe, and everybody's got one. And so yes, there's this physical universe. There's 7.5 billion psychic universes, all different, because we all have different experiences in our lifetime. And so a very large part of what his work is about is showing how we're all alike, but also talking about the differences, and saying what for example, Christ means from a psychological point of view for the rest of us. Okay. And so when Jung spoke of the God image, he was talking about the psychological God image and the instinct to have a religion. Okay, so primitive men, believe something mystical happens that causes this or that. And all of us do that. I mean, all of us say, geez, I put this rock in my pocket and therefore X happened, and so I'm going to carry this rock. This is my lucky rock.
And things do happen.
And things do happen, exactly. Okay, and so this group is about exploring what that's all about. And it's not about woo-wee-oo anything, okay? But it is saying that, things like the tarot and tea leaves and all those things, Ouija boards, they all work. They do, from a psychological point of view. And he was interested in that phenomenon. In fact, his doctor's thesis before 1900 was about his cousin who was a empath. And so his doctor's thesis is called something like manifestations of the so-called psychic or occult practices or something like that. And so he was writing about that from before the 20th century. But then he had his own confrontation with the unconscious. And no Jungian or most Jungians before 2009 didn't even know that the Red Book existed. Okay, so they had no contact with that. Okay, his immediate disciples, the people that were with him between, let's say, 1910 and 1960 or 61 when he died, those people knew that the Red Book existed. But I don't think that they understood the enormity of it. He had it in his study, and they knew he was referring to it during sessions that they had and so on. But I don't think that they fully appreciated what it was about. And so it was only when it was published in 2009 that we all realized that that was the basis of everything he did later. Everything came from that. And so there were all these Jungian analysts running around, and they were up here airy-fairy, but they didn't know what the foundation of their own practice was, right? And so finally, 48 years after his death, his heirs allowed it to be published. And it was this man, Sanush Shamdasani, from Great Britain, who has a professorship as the professor of Jung history at one of the colleges in London, that persuaded them to allow it to be published. And so that's why it's such a special book when you look at it. I mean, my copy of it it's this big and this thick, and you can get an appreciation by looking at it online in the Dropbox.
So were you saying that when he had his confrontation with the unconscious, is that reflected then in the Red Book?
Pardon? Yes.
So that's what that represents?
That's what it is, yeah.
Out through that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so it's an account of his experiences, what was happening to him. And the interesting thing is there's huge wisdom in this book. And it was his psyche giving him this wisdom, okay, through visions of various kinds. And, at one point, I'm on Twitter, so at one point I was finding paragraphs and saying, geez, I'd like to tweet this out. But in order, if you put it on Twitter, it ends up in reverse order. If you have 5 sentences, you can only put 1 sentence in each tweet, right? So if you put the first sentence in and then the next, then you end up putting it in reverse order for anybody that comes later, right? So I was tweeting it out in reverse order so that when people came later, they would find it in the correct order. But when I did that, I found that it makes absolutely as much sense backwards as forwards.
Oh my gosh.
you kidding me?
No, I'm not
I'm gonna
kidding
play
you.
He
with that.
devised it that way.
I don't think he intentionally did it, but that's just the way it is.
So it's kind of like it's pure thought.
It's pure thought, and it's a lot of it is pure wisdom. It's just phenomenal, and
You have that paragraph that
oh, so the issue was civilization versus instinct, right? And he said, too much civilization makes sick animals, but if you do everything by instinct, you can't have civilization, right? That's one of the dualities. And so we have instincts to do things, and some things are good and some things are bad. But you have to make your own decision. And so he lived in a menage a trois for his whole life, basically, okay, among other things, right? And so you'll see it in not that menage a trois, but his first experiences with it in this movie, A Dangerous Method, where he's dealing with Sabine Spielrein, who later became an analyst herself and was one of the first child psychologists. Okay, and much of what he later espoused actually may have come from Sabine. Okay, was her ideas.
sure.
Okay, but there's an interesting scene. He's giving therapy to another analyst named Otto Gross, who Otto Gross's father, thought he was crazy, and so he committed him to the Bergholzli, where Jung was then a doctor. And so some of the scenes in this movie are between Jung and Otto Gross. And Otto Gross is basically analyzing Jung instead of Jung analyzing Otto. And Jung says, or Otto says, Jung is arguing with himself about whether to follow his instinct to do something extramarital with Sabina, and Otto says, don't pass the oasis without taking a drink. Right? And so Otto was a little bit out there. Okay, Otto got sent to the Bergholzli because he presented his father with two perfectly good grandsons, one by his wife and one by his most respectable mistress.
Well, that wasn't anything new there. Civilization.
But Otto said, this is the way people are. Be honest with yourself. This is the way people are. And each person has to decide for themselves what's right. And so ultimately, I think what is clear about his life, and everybody agrees, is that he did have a 40-year affair with Toni Wolff, who was another woman that he actually met a little bit later. She comes in at the end of the movie just by name, but she was ultimately accepted by Emma because Emma knew, especially when he was going through this almost psychotic experience, this 5-year period of visioning. And I hear competing ideas about whether he was actually going into a psychosis or not. But he does say that it could have turned into a psychosis, except for the fact that he was a psychiatrist, so he knew what was going on. He recognized it. And
just barely.
Just barely.
He kept a gun in his drawer.
Right.
Oh, wow.
Very dark time.
I read in the reading, he was questioning himself about schizophrenia.
Yeah.
He had a rough childhood, didn't he? A family situation?
Well, he had a rough childhood, yes, because his mother was a little bit wacko, and she kept disappearing, and there's innuendo that she may have gone away to an institution a few times, but that's never really clearly said. But there's another interesting book right now. It's called Labyrinth, and it's the history of Emma Jung's marriage to Carl Jung. From Emma Jung's point of view,
That was interesting.
and I've had it on Audible. I've read all but the last 30 minutes of it, and it is awesome. It's very interesting because her reaction to all this stuff has never been really addressed very well. Okay, it's sort of a little addressed in the movie.
I'd love to hear your piece to that at some point in time.
It's in session. It's in session 4. So if I send you the links, which I will do.
You're releasing the Audible version of it?
No, I'm not releasing the Audible, but what I am releasing is the video of our class when we discussed it. Okay, and so that's on YouTube now. Okay. And that particular class we did at the library, so it was quieter.
And you discussed that movie in the library?
We discussed that movie in the library with all these kids running.
How'd that go, John?
Nobody
Well, we
knew.
were in an isolated section.
Nobody knew what we were
There
talking
were
about.
kids running around.
This is all we do. We're talking about these things, trying to bring people along so that they can understand, because one of the fundamental things about Jungian psychology is dreams and visions have meaning. They are your psyche telling you something that it needs to know, that you need to know. They come from the 2 million-year-old man. They come from evolution. Our psyche was formed by evolution. Let's say I was born in 1946, so I'm vintage 1946. My 2 million-year-old man has not changed since that vintage. Okay, I have not developed my instincts any further than what I had on the day of my birth. You're learning how to use them later on, but that's civilization. Okay, but your instincts come from this evolutionary process. Okay, but we're all born with this fundamental set of instincts. Okay, and so children are wild animals. Okay, you know that. Okay, so children are wild animals, and they don't know anything until they start to get told of it. But then they get raised in a culture. So there's no child that was raised in Tibet that has visions about Jesus Christ, and there's no child raised in Italy that has visions about the Buddha. But they do have vision, if they're Tibetan, they have visions about the Buddha, and if they're Italian, they might have visions about Christianity in some way, right?
You're saying that's enculturation.
That's culture, right? That's exactly culture. So everything that culture has laid on us is what it is. It's the rules, but the reality is that each one of us has to make our own decisions, and not all rules are perfect for everyone. For every politician who gets caught having a love affair, okay, there are probably 1 million men and women out there in the society that are having love affairs, and they're getting away with it, and their lives are enhanced by it. And Dr. Jung's life was enhanced by his affair with Toni Wolff. Now, how much of that was sexual, we'll never know. But what we do know is that for most of his career, his car was found parked at Toni Wolff's house every Wednesday. Okay, it was at Toni Wolff's house every Wednesday with Emma's knowledge, and meanwhile, Emma did say that she's very grateful to Toni because when he was going through the Red Book experiences, she couldn't help him. Okay, she didn't know enough, and she didn't have the education or the skill at that point to help him, and it was only Toni, who was coming along in psychoanalysis, who was able to analyze him.
So in short, she got a break from him, is what it sounds like.
Emma did, yeah.
That's what it sounds like. It made
Yeah.
like, oh, how great that he got help. You're like, trying to deal with somebody who's flipping out,
Right.
I'd
Right.
be grateful too if somebody took that off their hands
Sure.
for a night.
How
Sure.
old was he then, Skip,
During the crisis,
during the development of the Red Book?
it was he was 38 to, well, the visioning period was 38 to 43, which is a typical midlife crisis, right? And then he was making notes about it for the next 16 years. Okay, made notes in the so-called black books. We haven't seen the black books yet. They're working on it.
Really?
Yeah. Okay, he had these black notebooks that he kept notes in and made sketches in. And then he spent, at the end of the 5-year period, he spent 16 years literally putting it into calligraphy because he wanted, he bought a very expensive red folio volume and he started to do it like a monk did it, like a medieval monk. And he did that for 16 years until 1928. So I guess he started to do it in 1912 when he was having the visions. He kept doing it until 1928. And then Richard Wilhelm came to him with the I Ching, which Richard Wilhelm was a sinologist who had spent a lot of time in China, and he had translated the I Ching, okay, Lao Tzu's book. And he knew that it had psychological content, and he knew Jung, so he went to Jung and asked Jung if he would write a foreword to the I Ching, which he did. It's called The Secret of the Golden Flower, and that's in the Dropbox as well in the collected works section. Okay, it's called The Secret of the Golden Flower, and that's about a 60-page sort of summary of the I Ching in the context of Western psychology, all right? And what Jung realized from that was that medieval alchemy and early Chinese thought were of a piece. They were one and the same thing. And so from 1928 until his death in 1961, but up to, let's say, the next 30 years, he focused on alchemy. Okay? Because the early alchemists, I mean, this is an eye-opening experience, right? But the early alchemists were really not about chemistry at all. They weren't about making gold. They were about making psychic gold. And the psychic gold is the self, to understand yourself. Okay, and if you can achieve that, then you have gold. You have a happy life and you have gold if you know what you were meant to be. And so the process that Dr. Jung talked about throughout his career, ultimately he called individuation, which is the process by which we become what we were intended to be. Okay, and so you can think about it as Pygmalion or the statue of David. Okay, the statue of David was a block of marble, a huge block of marble. Two other sculptors had tried to do something with it and they gave up. Then Michelangelo worked on it for 4 years, chipping away bits of marble, and he ultimately revealed David. So this is what you're doing to yourself. You're chipping away all the obstructions to reveal what yourself is, okay, and what your contribution to the world is, what you're meant to be, what's the meaning of your life. So Dr. Jung's whole work was about that. How do you become that thing that you were intended to be? And so it gets quite deep. And so I'm a volunteer here. I'm asking for nothing except for your friendship and to come and we'll talk about it. And I don't have all the answers. I'm just, for the benefit of someone new, I'm giving you a quick précis on where we are and where we're going. But see, they need it too because it's a circumambulation, right? So from 1912 or 1909, let's say, until 1959, Dr. Jung wrote 20 volumes in his collected works, and that's not even all of it. That's what got into the first version of the collected works. Now they're going to do a new version that's going to have like 26 volumes in it.
Because the 20 volume on Amazon's like $2,200. It's on the wish list.
Yeah.
The 20 volume
Or-
hardcover set.
Yeah, or you can get the electronic version, the Kindle version for like $250 or something,
Right.
or $350
Probably
maybe.
make my Kindle explode.
Yeah, do that. And so, what I've been doing in my writing, which you'll see if you look at my website, is typically, I mean, today I did one that I didn't do this, but almost all my essays, I put a Jung quote on it, a paragraph quote or something, and from that quote, then I expand on what I'm talking about and what I learned from this quote and how it applies to our life today.
That's an endeavor, huge.
And it has become a huge endeavor. I mean, it's already a book on Amazon, and it could easily be another book. I just haven't put it together yet.